honeybees, welcome to the second video for Self-Love September in 2017. I'm going to be talking about self-love all month long on my YouTube channel because that is apparently just what I like to do year after year during the month of September. That's how things have worked out over here on Planet Maddox. So hopefully you will enjoy these resources. This video was requested a few times in different ways when I put the call out on my Facebook page asking what kinds of themes people wanted me to hit on this year. Quite a few people expressed their interest in having some sort of resource to help them to maintain boundaries that they had drawn around themselves in relation to interacting with certain people. So I was hearing from people who have cut ties with a family member or decided to distance themselves from somebody to whom they used to be very close for their own mental and emotional well-being, but they were struggling to actually keep to those boundaries. They were struggling to avoid being ground down by the demands or the desires of the other person or other people. And so there was very much this interest in having a video that was centered around how to stay strong, how to stick with your choice when you've decided to set up a boundary between you and another person. And this is something that I really like talking about, and I feel that I come from a place of quite a lot of personal experience on this issue. Family wise, I have definitely had to draw really strong boundaries. I've had to make some incredibly tough decisions. I've had to make some decisions at times that other people might consider to be extreme for my mental and emotional well-being. So this is a topic that I definitely feel I can speak to, and it gives me great pleasure to speak to it. So the first thing that I really wanted to come through and say with this resource is that you've got to be clear when you want to maintain a boundary and you're really sure it's the right thing for you, but you feel pressured to, engage in conversation with someone or spend more time with someone than you want to, or any time with them at all. You've got to be clear on why the boundary is so important. And sometimes that really takes for you to just sit down and actually be clear on it, write it down. Normally that's the key thing that I do to get really clear about something. I have so many different thoughts rattling around in my head, and this is true for a lot of people, that when you sit down and you actually write down in plain English the things that you really want to focus on, the things that you think are important, it clears away a lot of the clutter. It actually sorts what's important from all the other stuff that's whirling around in there and making a mess of things and making you feel very blurry and very unhinged and very confused. So for me, it takes to write it down. I also like to talk it through sometimes, either with somebody who does a similar kind of job to me, some kind of a alternative therapist who can hold space for me, or a trusted close friend, somebody in my life that I know I can just just get it all out to, and they will hold the space for me. So talking it out is useful as well. Writing it down is useful. I feel like there's ways to get clarity, and essentially what you're doing is you are pinpointing why the boundary is so important. Why is it important for your mental health? Why is it important for your emotional well-being? If you dissolve the boundary, what happens then? What kinds of negative effects do you think it will have? How will it be detrimental to you? There's another side of the coin with this which I think is equally important, and that is, if you've had the boundary in place for any length of time already, then you might want to look at the evidence for the positive effects that that has had on your life. If you actually drew the boundary a while ago, whether it's to do with the complete elimination of a relationship from your life, or just basically the distancing or the reducing of your interaction with a person, what have the positive effects of that been? What kinds of evidence can you see that the boundary that you've drawn was necessary for you and has been positive for you? If you feel like you haven't actually seen any beneficial effects yet, how do you plan to bring that stuff into your life? How can you now start to use the fact that you're spending less time and less energy on this connection that you feel was very toxic, very bad for you? How can you now reinvest that time and energy into the stuff that you love, into nurturing yourself, into your passions, whatever you want to do, or maybe even investing it into other relationships that might have been suffering before as a result of the fact that you were suffering? Really think about how you want to take that energy, that time, that mental space that you're no longer spending on this relationship where you've drawn the boundary, and actually reinvest it elsewhere. So if you're not seeing any positive effects, how can you bring them into your line of sight now? When we have to make a decision to pull up a drawbridge between ourselves and another individual or a group of individuals, there can be feelings of guilt. There can definitely be feelings of guilt that sometimes actually end up eroding the boundary because you just really feel that you cannot uphold that drawbridge. You just feel too bad. You feel like you have a duty almost to go back into the interactions with somebody. You have a duty to give yourself fully to the relationship again, even though it is very toxic for you. I think that if you're feeling pangs of guilt you really need to ask yourself, did you do everything that you could do to maintain the relationship? Did you put the effort into maintaining it? And did you just find that every time you put that effort in, something just wasn't working and the toxicity kept rolling around again and again? Be really honest with yourself. I think in some cases it is true that we pull up a drawbridge and we say, you know what, I need to remove myself from this, or I can't be around you anymore, or, you know, the relationship isn't going to be that close anymore. And afterwards, in hindsight, we do recognise that we didn't really try hard enough to understand the other person's point of view, or we did walk away from a conflict situation too quickly, and we do want to go back in with a clearer head, with a lot more objectivity, because we've taken that distance and we can do that. In some cases, it is appropriate to lower the drawbridge again and actually start to interact with this person again. Sure, that is appropriate. And in a number of cases, in my personal experience, this has been what I have concluded from spending some time consciously away from somebody. I've come to this point in my distance from them where I've thought to myself, I actually could go back in with a clear head and operate in a different manner, and maybe we could see if we could resolve this or if we could move past it. There's nothing wrong with concluding that, but do make sure that you're not just concluding that because of feelings of guilt. Make sure that you are prioritising your mental well-being. Make sure you are prioritising care for your own emotions. So essentially, what I think I'm asking you to consider here is, did you give it enough of a try before you set that firm boundary? Did you do everything that it was within your capability to do at the time to try and make it work? If the answer to both of those things is yes, then you're perfectly okay to maintain that firm boundary. The other thing, of course, you need to ask yourself is the boundary necessary for the maintenance of your mental well-being? Is it necessary for you to actually feel okay and go on and thrive in life? Is it necessary in order to remove really negative energies that were going on in your life? If the answers to those questions is yes, then you're perfectly within your right to defend that boundary. But like I said, in some cases, yes, it will be evident that you feel you didn't do enough and you feel that you can go in now with that objectivity. And people do change their minds, and people do roll back around to relationships because they feel like they can give it more of a go and they can approach it differently. But you've got to make sure that you're not making that decision because of guilt or because of feelings of obligation to that person. You've got to make sure that that kind of decision comes from a place of knowing your own mind and knowing that you can go back into the relationship feeling okay about, you know, reopening that interaction. Whenever we have drawn a firm boundary with somebody and we find that that boundary is being tested, like for example, if somebody is really vying for a position back into our lives again, or somebody is just trying to push us into doing something more than we said we would commit, one of the things that really helps with that is knowing your communication style, understanding how to communicate your limitations clearly, understanding how to reinstate your boundaries in a verbal way and doing it firmly, but doing it fairly, you know, doing it with a certain tone that actually implies autonomy over your decisions whilst not being really needlessly rude or unnecessarily ruthless. So it's about practicing. And I really feel like that's something that I've learned on my personal journey, is it's really been about learning how I can communicate with sovereignty and communicate clearly and communicate unapologetically what I will and will not accept and what I am and am not prepared to do. And one thing I always say about clear communication and bold communication is practice makes fantastic, baby. And that's really the long and short of it. I often tell clients to practice saying what they need to say in front of a mirror so they can actually look at themselves and engage with themselves and look at their things like pace, intonation, what they're doing with their hands. Do they look nervous? Are they fiddly? Is their voice shaking? And try to improve upon that. I also advise clients to practice with a friend or a partner what they want to say. I advise clients to record themselves saying what they're going to say. I really don't think there's anything wrong with practicing key phrases or practicing saying things that you feel it's important to get across when your boundary is being tested, when you feel that your boundary is being breached by somebody. It really helps to understand what it is that pushes your buttons when you're communicating with a certain person. It helps to understand what tends to make you see red, what tends to make you respond in a way that you later feel to be actually quite regrettable. It helps to actually have a handle on these things so that when you're in that kind of high intensity situation, you can kind of have a little light that goes on in your head that says, okay, my buttons are being pressed now and I really want to react in a certain way, but I've decided not to react in that way, and now is my chance to choose differently. It really helps to have that, helps to understand how your buttons tend to be pressed, and it might be different in your relationships with different people. But I know that for me, I'm a classic hothead. I'm someone that's had to work on that for fucking years. I started meditating at 19 because I needed a way to help me with my rage. I would react without thinking, I would react without feeling, I would react from a place of defensiveness, and I would be really enraged a lot of the time. So I feel like I've come from this very long journey. I'm kind of like a veteran now of knowing what pushes my buttons and understanding that I have a choice in how I respond. So that's one part of understanding your communication style, your abilities with communication, and understanding how you can evolve so that you are communicating more effectively and you're not communicating in a way that you're later going to regret, which isn't really much of a communication at all a lot of the time. We look back on it and we think, what was that? I should have communicated clearly, I should have reinstated the boundary, but instead I kowtowed, or I freaked out, or I was passive aggressive, or whatever it is, however it tends to work for you. And again, practice makes perfect in these kinds of situations. Knowing how you want to respond when your buttons are being pushed or your boundaries are being pushed is important, and understanding that you can actually get those things in mind and feel prepared to say those things or feel prepared to react in that way is important. Don't pressure yourself to talk to somebody else on their terms if you have instated a boundary that says that things are now going to be on your terms. If the boundary has already been set, you can feel free to stick to it. You are allowed to stand your ground firmly but politely if you want to maintain that distance and you do not want to do what the other person is asking you to do. If you have already declared your boundary to be a complete policy of no contact, then you can feel free to not contact somebody who is hounding you and pressuring you for contact. You've already made your position clear, you've already explained yourself, and if you really feel like it's going to be damaging to reopen that or reopen that time and time again, then you've got to be on your own side. You've got to be an ally to yourself. I'm not one of these people that's ever going to advise you to keep going over and over and over the same ground in any kind of relationship if it's not doing you any fucking good and you feel like you're bashing your head off a brick wall every time you do it. And I'm not one of those people that's ever going to tell you that you need to keep doing that with a family connection because it is a family connection. I think that is BS. I think that is some real toxic bullshit. I think that's something that a lot of mainstream society are being forced to swallow. I think there is some progression when it comes particularly to family ties and how it's okay to walk away from family ties that are toxic and make that decision for yourself ultimately. But I think at the same time, there's still obviously a really long way to go. There are a lot of people that I see pushing themselves time and time again into something that's completely damaging because they share a certain percentage of DNA with the other person involved. And I'm never going to be the kind of person that's going to say that that's okay and that's right and that's, you know, morally right. Actually, sometimes I think it's important to conclude your relationship with a family member if you feel like it's actually getting unbearable for you. It's becoming completely out of hand. There's no change that you can see in sight and you really feel like it's taking a massive toll on your mental well-being. Yes, I do think it is okay to instate a boundary of no contact. I'm definitely not going for the hard sell here. I'm not insisting that everybody agrees with me on what I'm saying. I'm just being really clear about my position and saying that I don't personally think I'll ever be the kind of person who's going to say you need to keep forging ahead with that toxic as fuck relationship because the two of you share, you know, some strands of DNA. I'm not going to be the person to advise that. I don't think there's anything unspiritual about reaching the point where you've decided not to give a relationship endless chances. I don't think it's unspiritual to recognise the point at which a relationship has become unsalvageable in your estimation. One thing that I definitely encourage you to recognise if you have set up some kind of a boundary with someone in your life and they are not liking it and they're trying to push for a relationship or they're just trying to push your buttons in some way, is that sometimes the boundary that you've set up might be detestable to the other person, but it could ultimately be the right thing for both of you. Sometimes an individual just wants to remain on the BS carousel. They just want to swim around in the crap fest that a relationship has become. They do not see a way that they can climb out of it. They do not envision the possibility of drawing their own boundary or saying no or saying this is unhealthy for both of us. And sometimes it actually takes the stronger person to draw that boundary and stick to it. And it might well also be the best possible thing for the other person too. It's not really likely that if something was toxic as shit from your perspective, it was going to be awesome and everything was gravy on the other side. Actually, what was more likely is that it was also toxic for them. It's also harmful to them. At the very least, it's not helping that other person to grow. And at the most, it's helping them to continue being abusive or to continue manipulating. And you stepping away is making sure that they don't have the advantage to do that, at least not where you're concerned. As I mentioned at the beginning of my Self-Love September series for this year, everybody's individual circumstances are different. One person will be watching this video from one perspective and somebody else will be watching it with a completely different thing in mind. So obviously all the advice that I give can only ever be general. If you want to get tailored one-on-one advice, if you want me to hold space for you to talk through your particular issues and you want to actually strategize and figure out a framework to deal with that, you can book me. You know, the link to my website is always below and we can have a chat on a more personal basis. When it comes to these video resources, I'm throwing out a few different possibilities and I'm hoping to cover enough ground that a lot of different people with different circumstances feel that they're getting something from it. So obviously, if you're envisioning a specific relationship while you're listening to this video, then I might not exactly be hitting the nail on the head for you, and that's okay. But what I would say is that without any shadow of a doubt, sometimes when you set up a boundary and the other person is pissed off by that boundary, it is very much the case that the boundary is probably the best thing for both of you. Sometimes a person just can't draw a boundary. They almost can't stop their own behaviour. There is this repetition, there is this compulsion. They need to carry on with it and they're not even sure why. They just feel this deep-seated urge to keep pushing your buttons or keep letting their buttons be pushed or keep getting into that same pointless conversation which only leads to toxicity. And if you have set up a boundary, then even if they resent it, they probably actually need it as well. So you're still doing the right thing. And ironically, in many ways, you're probably doing a loving thing. Just because the other person doesn't see your boundary as loving doesn't mean that it's not. Some people just need to stop, and sometimes the only way that you can get a kid to stop wrecking a toy is to just take it the fuck away from them. And sometimes that's how it's got to be in relationships. You've got to actually remove the apparatus that somebody is climbing all over because they're in danger of hurting themselves, and if they won't come down of their own accord, then you've just got to dismantle the fucking jungle gym. You've got to get rid of that climbing frame. That's the weirdest analogy I think I've ever used on the channel, but that's what came in to my bonce, so that's what I said. One thing I definitely don't want to end this video without mentioning is that sometimes other people get involved. Sometimes it is not as cut and dried as you just drawing up a boundary or pulling up that drawbridge and saying no more or trying to get things more on your terms. It would be lovely if it was always just the case that something was between you and another individual, but quite often there are people that come in and they want to help or they want to interfere or they want to stir the pot, they want to be involved in some way. And sometimes other people will try to come in and they'll try to influence your decision. They'll try to take a position of power. They'll try to have some kind of authority over you or the other person or what you both decide to do. So sometimes you do need to actually give ultimatums. You do need to communicate directly with anybody else who's trying to encroach on the relationship between you and this other person. And you need to say, this is how it feels when you interfere, and this is the consequence of interference. This is what it's doing to me. Let them know how it feels. Let them know that you expect them to respect your needs. And that in itself is the ultimatum. When you let somebody know that you expect respect regarding the decisions that you've made, and you expect that certain things are not going to be brought up again because that's your final fucking word on it, then that in itself is an ultimatum. The way somebody chooses to behave after you have really instated that boundary with them very strongly will speak volumes about how much that relationship matters to them. It will speak volumes about the extent to which they really feel like they can breach your boundaries time and time again. And so really, the way that they behave when you say to them, no interferences, this is between me and this other person, I really need you to respect this, even though I know it's difficult. You know, the way they behave after you have expressed that really does tell you something. And I think that's why a lot of people are scared to speak an ultimatum like that, because they don't really want to see how the other person is going to react. It hurts, it really hurts when you set up a boundary and you say, look, I really don't want you to interfere, this is between me and this other person, and then you find that that loved one continues to try and push for their own result. They continue to try and force their own agenda. that hurts. And I think that's why a lot of the time we try to avoid these ultimatums. We try to avoid saying, look, it's really important to me that you don't push me on this. This is my decision and I'm doing it for my own emotional well-being. It's really hard to watch somebody continue to encroach on your boundaries or try and push their own agenda, but be brave enough to give an ultimatum if you feel like that is what's actually necessary. Look, if you've made your mind up on something and you know that it is the best thing for you, then there's no point in going round and round and round on this carousel of having the same conversation with this other person anyway, because your mind is made up. So essentially this person that's like interfering is basically asking you to expend loads of time and loads of energy on something which is essentially done and dusted for you. So it doesn't make any sense, and it is something that you need to cut off from. It is something that needs to stop. Whether that stops because they respect that you want it to stop, or whether it stops because they don't respect it and you then need to pull up a drawbridge with them as well, the fact is you can't keep going around having the same conversation about something which is done and dusted for you. It's tiring, it's draining, it's energy zapping, it's maddening. There's no point to it. At the same time, and this is the tough loving part, this is the more shadowy side of the coin, be clear on what you actually want from other people. Be clear about that. I think sometimes we actually are not sure what we want from other people, and we do tend to send out mixed signals at times. If you just want somebody to hold some space for you and let you vent because you're going through the difficult decision of setting up a strong boundary with a loved one, then choose somebody who is just going to hold that space for you and let you vent. If you keep going to somebody to have space held, but they are the kind of person that will interfere and will give you their opinion and will be very strong with that opinion, then you're choosing the wrong kind of support system. You're selecting the wrong individual to give you support. It's important that you recognise if you don't want advice, if you don't want somebody interfering, if you do not really want somebody's input, don't go to somebody who consistently tends to give you those things. Instead, go to somebody that you can ask them to just hold some space for you and listen in a non-judgmental way, and allow somebody to do that. And if you feel like you might need a professional to do that in some context, then if you have the means, obviously go to a professional. If you know somebody who works in that kind of professional capacity who would be willing to provide a session or two of free support, then obviously take them up on that. If you know somebody who tends to have that Queen of Cups energy, that energy that just allows them to hold space whilst being completely impartial and objective, go and ask that person if you can just spend some time talking. Don't go to somebody who does tend to be really kind of, interfering, I suppose you could say, in their nature. Don't go to somebody who has a vested interest in the outcome. I think that's really important as well. Don't go to somebody who actually wants to see it turn out a particular way and will be very interested in sticking their fucking oar in to make sure that their agenda is realised. Make sure you go to somebody who either doesn't know the other person or will be willing to be objective and hold objective, impartial space for you. You've got to know when you're going to the wrong person, I think, and you've also got to know when you're trying to triangulate. And this is something I really want to mention. Again, it's a tough, loving piece of advice. It's a shadow worky piece of advice. But sometimes you go to a particular person for advice or support because you know that that person is linked to the other person that you're not involved with anymore. And you're actually trying to get a message back to that person that you don't communicate with anymore, using the middleman as a conduit. Be honest with yourself about whether or not you are doing that. Are you triangulating? Are you going to somebody who actually is involved with both you and the other person and actually offloading to them, revealing your truth to them, talking about your feelings to them in the hope that they will then go and divulge certain things to the other person, or in the hope that they will try to twist the situation to your advantage? If you're doing that, then you're playing a very dangerous game with your own emotional health, and you're also actually not setting up a boundary. If you're triangulating, if you're involving other people who are also involved with this person that you're detaching from, then you are not detaching from them. You are not setting up a boundary. Not really. You're still communicating with that other person, but in a really underhanded and manipulative way. And you have to own that. You really have to own that. So ask yourself if that is part of the narrative for you. And maybe out of interest, you might want to look back over past situations where you have triangulated or you have experienced the effects of triangulation, and think about what you can learn from that, what lessons you can extract from that, and how you can use those lessons in the future. Most of my notes are just one or two key words or a couple of phrases, so I can just get it in my head and then ramble. But there's this great big paragraph down at the bottom that I wrote out in full, so I really want to read read it to you guys. It says, when does a boundary within a relationship need to become a severing of the relationship completely? Does it need to get to breaking point before you sever? For me, an established boundary should be respected. For instance, no talking politics or religion would be a boundary that would need to be respected. No interfering in my relationship, that would be a boundary that somebody in my life might need to respect. If you have to keep reinstating that boundary, it's time to think about stronger action. Breaking point, if it comes, will probably feel like you're taking action to defend your sanity or well-being in a dire emergency. Sometimes great clarity can come out of such situations, but you may want to enforce a temporary distance rather than announcing a need for something permanent. The boundary that you set with somebody may not necessarily be a complete severing of the relationship. You know, you might not decide at first that you just want to stop talking to this person after the first infraction. You may not decide that the first boundary that you set with somebody after they've annoyed you multiple times is to stop speaking to them. You may decide that there's some form of middle ground, and that's totally fine. I've had to instate certain boundaries so that a connection can continue in my life without the tension and the toxicity which comes from one particular kind of conversation. So I've had to shut down certain things. I've had to say, look, I love you, but we never see eye to eye on this. It always ends up in the same crapshoot. How about we don't talk about it? How about we don't go there? And if that is not respected, and if my boundary or my rule that I've set up is pushed again and again, then I feel like more serious action needs to be taken. Like I need to reduce my interaction with this person or eliminate the connection, whatever the circumstance calls for. It's on a case-by-case basis. So it may not necessarily be the case that you are always dealing with someone that you've severed ties with, but you may have wanted to create some kind of a rule within the bounds of the relationship which helps the relationship to run smoothly. And if the other person is always butting heads with that rule, then obviously that's going to annoy the crap out of you, and obviously you're going to feel like you're not being listened to and you're not being respected, at which point you might want to think about reducing or eliminating that connection. Okay, that's the name of that tune. There is going to be so much more coming, guys. I'm uploading every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Please use the hashtags selflovesept and selflovestories to communicate via YouTube and social media and let us know what your self-love stories are, or give your responses to the resources that I'm putting out. Don't forget, I've got Self-Love Sunday every Sunday on SoundCloud this month. Much love until next time. Blessed be. Mwah. Oh, I found an altar space. Just set up here.